Welcome to Crops TV here. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about corn and cereal rye cover crops and kind of making that relationship work. As they've already mentioned, I'm Mark Licht. I'm an extension cropping system specialist here with the university. So just to set the tone here, the stage a little bit, why are we really talking about cereal rye as that cover crop? And really it's because, at least as of right now anyhow, that's the predominant cover crop species that's being used within the state. So I think this data here is maybe a year or two old now, but at the time of this, the cereal rye was accounting for about 90% of those cover crop acres. Some of the cost share programs do require an enhancement. That's why the numbers tally up to greater than 100%, because in order to get that enhancement, essentially you're looking at a mixture of cover crop species. And so when we start to think of those mixtures, that's when the radishes and turnips and some of the legumes come into play. And then we also have some situations where we mix oats with cereal rye or oats and wheat together, so we get a little bit more biomass in the fall, and then have a little less opportunity there in the spring. So looking at it, cereal rye has been the by far and ahead the choice that most people are aiming for. And right now we have roughly 5% of the state's row crop corn and soybean acres that are using some sort of a cover crop there. The other thing I wanted to highlight or touch into here really quickly at the beginning is, what are we looking at as far as some of the challenges that we have? And the biggest thing that we hear is, well, what's it going to do to our corn yields and our soybean yields? And so this is data from a 10-year study that the Iowa Learning Farms did, and it started back in 2008. Total of roughly 70 site years. And one of the things that we see with this, when we're going into corn, a lot of times there is no yield change, but occasionally we do see that there is a yield reduction there, especially on those initial establishment years, I'll call it, the first 2 or 3 years. Once we get established, we get comfortable with the practice, all of a sudden our no change takes up a little bit higher percentage. Occasionally we will see some yield improvement, and then there is some risk with cover crops still, and so every now and then there is that yield reduction that occurs. If I just flip and I show you the soybean portion of that, it's interesting that obviously with soybeans, we're not seeing the yield reduction show up in those establishment years. The no change now has become roughly in both the establishment and non-establishment years is roughly 2/3 of the time. But we do start to see some yield improvement a little bit more consistently there. We do get yield reductions. Again, cover crops are a little risky, especially in the spring of the year, and that's what happens in these. It just happened to be those 2 site years where we had a yield reduction on the soybean yields was when we had wetter springs, and we had a lot of growth and termination and planting, and everything kind of got jumbled up there, and that created some of that yield penalty that we see. When we kind of think about cover crops, especially cereal rye ahead of corn, as I've talked with farmers and agronomists, the challenges that get noted to me are that establishment in the fall, termination in the spring, and then changing the tillage and fertility program up a little bit. And so those are the challenges that we have. And I really look at these, quite honestly, I look at them as opportunities, because now what we're able to do is we're able to fine tune our cropping system. Actually, from a tillage and fertility program standpoint, we may actually be doing some bigger changes there. And so what we're doing is we're trying to start to balance some of the environmental aspects of crop production with the productivity and the economic side of it. And so look at this as opportunities to try to figure out how to do things a little bit more efficiently, a little bit better from that perspective. Okay, so before I jump too far into this, I'm going to talk here for a little bit about 2 studies in particular, and I just want to show you what those studies are before I jump into them, so I don't break up some of the train of thought as we get to that. So the first trial, what we really were focused on was how do we manage cereal rye ahead of that corn crop. And so for this trial, we actually had 3 locations, and it was conducted in the 2019 and 2020 growing seasons. And those locations were up by Sutherland, right outside of Ames here, and then down by Crawfordsville. We had, I'll call them 2 systems, although we termed it more as seeding methods. We had the broadcasting system, which was broadcasting into the soybean crop in the early September time frame. We had what we termed as a low, medium, and high seeding rate within. That medium seeding rate at the time, that was kind of what the NRCS recommendation was, that we were trying to target and to say, should we be shifting one way or the other. Then for the drilled seeding system, that was after the soybeans had been harvested. And so we had one year where we were closer to that mid-October, and then here in 2020 for that growing season, we were able to get in just a little bit earlier, so maybe that early to mid time frame in October. Again, we had 3 seeding rates that again were the low, medium, and the high, and again that medium was kind of the drilled recommendation when we started down this path. And so we can kind of look at them as 2 systems that we were really looking at there. And then at the Ames location, we had 2 termination timings. The 3 and 14 days before planting was when we were terminating that cover crop. At Crawfordsville and Sutherland, we just used the single termination timing of 14 days before planting. And then the other trial that I'll get to here is basically looking at how do we manage corn following a cereal rye. So we had 2 locations over 2 years, 2019 and 2020 growing seasons by Kanawha and then just outside of Ames here. We looked at no-tillage and strip-tillage. And then for the nitrogen part of this, what we did, we had 3 different starter nitrogen rates. We had 0, 35, and 70 pounds of nitrogen. But we were putting on the same amount of total nitrogen for that corn crop. And so at the time of side dress, we came back in and we put on the remainder from what we had already put on at side dress. Okay, so those are the 2 trials that I'm going to highlight and talk about it here as we move forward. So establishment in the fall, I tend to think of establishing cover crops in the fall, kind of like we do with the nutrient management 4Rs, where we have the right rate, we have the right source, the right time, the right place. Obviously, we're shifting those terms a little bit. We're talking about the species that we're using, the seeding rate, the time that we do that seeding, and then the type of seeding method that we have. These have really big interactions that occur. So obviously, the seeding time frame that we're wanting to fit into and the seeding method are going to dictate what species are available for us and what we can use. The species that we want to use is going to dictate our seeding rates with it as well, right? So there's nice interactions that come into play there, but I think if we think through making sure that we're matching up, the species, the seeding rate, the seeding time frame, and the seeding method, we can start to focus in on how do we do that most effectively and get good establishment. So here I'm going to show you some of the biomass data. I'm not going to show you a fancy figure for our fall biomass data largely because 2018 and 2019, those falls, we just did not get much biomass grown. 2018 was cooler and wetter, a little bit earlier fall. And so what we ended up with were some treatments and methods predominantly up at Sutherland, where we just did not get germination and emergence in the fall, right? And so that affected that fall biomass. 2019, it was a little bit warmer and a little bit longer fall, But again, up at Sutherland, we just didn't have much biomass, especially in the drilled method up there. So normally in the fall, we'd like to see something north of 400 or 500 pounds of biomass to make sure that we get good growth and good coverage from nutrient uptake and minimizing erosion and runoff. Looking at the spring growth of the biomass, and here what I'm showing you is actually the biomass at the time of termination for that 14-day before planting period. A couple things to point out as we look at these numbers. Obviously, the broadcast in both years had much more growth than we did with the drilled. Again, I think part of that attributes back to in the spring we had to wait for some of those drilled plots to germinate and emerge before we really got much biomass accumulation going. The other thing that's quite noticeable in that figure is the difference in biomass from 2019 to 2020. This is very noticeable, and when we look at when the cover crop greened up in 2019, it was in the early April timeframe, whereas in 2020 it greened up in early March. So about a 30-day advantage is what 2020 had as far as that biomass accumulation. So a pretty stark difference there. It roughly comes out to be about 600 to 900 heat units that we had more to get that biomass in 2020. When I looked at the main effects of the seeding rate, the differences, or so to speak, the responses were much more muted than what we had with the seeding method, or the kind of looking at that entire system there, right? In 2019, there's essentially no difference. In 2018, that high seeding rate did have slightly higher biomass accumulation. And when we break this out by individual site year, there are some site years where it's a nice stair step from low to medium to high, and others where it's completely flat across there. And again, I think that's largely just a factor of what those spring conditions were, and allowing for that adequate biomass growth to occur. Just to quickly show you the yield differences here with the broadcast versus the drilled versus the no-rye check. Drill seeding versus the no-rye check, essentially no difference in yields. Statistically, not any different. Numerically, there's a little bit there, but nothing consistent. But that broadcast does drop, and did drop our yield potential quite a bit, 13 to 28 bushels lower. And again, it's a larger drop in 2020, and it goes back to that we had much more biomass in 2020 than we did in 2019. So there was a stark yield drag that was associated with that broadcast timing and method. When we looked at the yield impact from the seeding rates, statistically there were no differences between the various seeding rates and the no-rye check. Although in 2020 you do see that there may be a slight downward trend there. And again, I think when we break that out and look at it on an individual site year, where we had more biomass in Crawfordsville, even Ames in 2020, there is a little bit more impact because of that seeding rate. So that higher seeding rate did have a little bit more biomass, and so therefore it is pulling down the yields a little bit when we look at it at an individual site year. So how do we move forward, looking at this data? How do we move forward with kind of some of those establishment recommendations? And so I think, this is really a hard thing for me to come out and say, you got to go one way versus the other, because I think it is a little bit of an individual decision here, right? So it comes back to, what are your goals of having a cover crop out there for? How much tolerance or risk can you withstand? So I think if we're comfortable with that broadcast timing and the broadcast method, the time frame of August 20th to September 10th really does work well. Obviously, we have to be cognizant of soil moisture, rainfall patterns, because if we put it out there and it's dry, we're probably not going to get much benefit, not get good establishment from it, right? And then if we have warmer falls, we might be able to shift that back, another 10 days or so. But it all depends on kind of what those late August, September, October forecasts are looking like. If we're comfortable with the drilled seeding, now all of a sudden we can extend out our time. We'd love to see it before October 15th, just because we do get that germination and emergence then in the fall. But basically from these two studies and a couple others that I'm aware of, once we get to seeding beyond November 1, we just don't get the fall benefit. We don't get enough growth on it. We may get germination in some years, we may not. If we get growth, it's only an inch or two of height that we're getting there. So we're not necessarily getting the full benefit of a cereal rye when we drill it, after that November 1 time frame. We still can get the benefit in the spring because it will germinate and emerge in the spring, and then we'll get that spring growth. It's just that biomass is also not going to be as much as if we got some germination, emergence, and growth there in the fall. Okay, so now going from fall establishment and looking at the spring termination, and we know that there's other termination methods out there. There's several of them that can be used. We're not ahead of corn anyhow. We're just really not confident that we can use mowing and roller crimping, just because by the time we let the rye get big enough to mow it or roller crimp it and effectively kill it, we're pushing that corn planting date back just too much, and we're going to see too big of a yield penalty from that. But we know that we can get effective termination using a herbicide program. This image here I'm showing is actually where the farmer or the co-op had put on glyphosate, and they used a nearly a full rate of urea ammonium nitrate for the following corn crop, and then we have some antagonistic effects coming through. But if we're using herbicide programs like glyphosate at a full rate, making sure we have active growth on that cover crop, we can effectively kill it. The tillage side, I'm a little less confident in. So that picture there is illustrating. I think you can definitely see that it has been disked once. Unfortunately, it rained after that evening, and it reestablished. Right. The other thing that may be a little bit harder to see there, but when you disk or you do some tillage with cereal rye, those roots are holding on to that soil, and so you usually get a very rough seed bed. And usually, if you're trying to get that seed bed smoothed out, you're going to end up with 2, maybe even 3 tillage passes to get it smoothed down, and then have you now all of a sudden negated the benefits that you got from having that cereal rye out there. So when we look at termination timing, again, this is the Ames location in 2019 and 2020. Essentially, we had 11 days difference in growth. And yeah, there was slight changes from one year to the next there, but the big difference was almost a 2 to 2.5 times the amount of biomass growth that you gained by having that 3 days before planting termination timing. Okay. So yeah, you can get more growth by leaving it out there longer. But when we look at the yield side of it, that's where some challenges come in with that. And so here what I've now put up on the right-hand side, we're looking at the check that had no rye and comparing it with the 14-day before planting termination or the 3-day before planting termination. Both years, the check and the 14-day before planting termination were not statistically different. In 2019, that 3-day before planting, we had a yield penalty associated with it. That was a minus 11, right? 2020, it was much less and not statistically different, but it was a little bit lower, right? It was 3 bushels lower than the 14 in the check, but statistically, they were the same. So there is a little bit of risk when we get out there to the 3-day before planting termination timing, and that can lead to a yield penalty for various reasons here. So as far as the kind of the key to success in that termination category is really looking at that termination at 10 to 14 days before planting, before 8 inches. That 8-inch mark is roughly 800 to 1,000 pounds of biomass. There's some other data sets that suggest that there's minimal yield penalty if we terminate before we get up to 1,000 pounds. The higher risk is when we start getting rye biomass, above 1,500 to 2,000 pounds of biomass growth on that cover crop. And again, just to reiterate, glyphosate at a full rate when that cereal rye is actively growing is really a quite effective way of terminating a cereal rye cover crop. Okay, looking here at changing our tillage and our fertility program, this is a good place just to point out that this is really where having and adding in cover crops makes it no longer a plug-and-play add-on to our traditional cropping system. Right, we're really having to change some practices where we might have used a fall fertility program for nitrogen, or we might have done some residue management or tillage in the fall. Now we're really thinking that we need to get that moved into the spring time frame to be able to use those cover crops and make sure we have the benefits from them that we're looking for. So again, we're really looking at moving our nitrogen into the spring. It can still be pre-plant, but we just don't want it to be at the same time as our termination, especially if we're using liquid nitrogen there. And we don't necessarily want to put on that nitrogen while that cover crop is actively growing, because we don't need to feed it. We want to save that nitrogen so it's fully available for the corn crop. John Sawyer's done some work that's pointed out that there's no additional nitrogen need for a corn crop just because it's following a cereal rye cover crop. So no adjustments there on total nitrogen for the program, but because we're now moving potentially from a fall to a spring, we might be considering, do we want to look at a split application? Do we want to put some on at the time of planting as a starter or even broadcast? And then put on the remainder as a side dress, whether it's more the traditional time from V5 to V6, or if you look at an earlier side dress, depending on what that split looks like. So there is an opportunity there to fine tune and to adjust that fertility program. So I mentioned that we did have a strip tillage and a starter nitrogen trial up at the research farm up at Kanawha, and then over here by Ames. So this is the biomass. Obviously, we don't need to worry about the rye biomass there in as far as the breakdown between the starter nitrogen rates, because the starter nitrogen rates really didn't influence that biomass because it was done at the time of planting. But what that does, maybe indicators show a little bit, and you can see it off in those red bars, indicates that maybe the amount of variability that we do have with that biomass growth. Obviously, same thing that I showed before is that 2019 we had much less biomass growth than we did in 2020. And so it was good to see, a little bit of a difference there to help us pull some things out. Strip tillage, in this situation, that strip tillage was done in Ames both years. It was done in late fall, so it was closer to that November 1 time frame. Up at Kanawha, 1 year it was done late fall, and 1 year it was done pretty early in the spring. And so what you do see there is that the strip tillage pass did reduce the amount of rye biomass that we had by about 40 to 50%, maybe a little bit higher than I had expected. But I did expect it to reduce that spring biomass growth that we had, and so it did do that. When we were planting, it did free up, so we did not have rye in that row zone, and so from that standpoint, it did work pretty effectively. When I look at the yields there, between the no rye check and the strip tillage, our yields were similar across the board. That holds true even if we looked at the individual site years. Now with strip tillage, again, statistically they weren't different, but numerically there was a little bit lower yield there with the no-till. When we look at the effect from the starter nitrogen, this was a little bit of a surprise for me, but as we went from 0 to 35 to 75, or excuse me, to 70 pounds of nitrogen, we had a diminishing return there from a yield perspective. And I did not expect that. The what we'd been hearing and what people were talking about was if we have nitrogen immobilized because the cover crop took it up, or we were waiting for it to decompose and become readily available again, then we put on starter nitrogen and we'll get a positive response, or at least have no yield difference. But what we found was not the case there. And I'm not entirely sure of what went on. I think, but I think we need more work on this. But I think what maybe happened is that 35 and 70 pounds of starter nitrogen was put on at the time of planting, right? And then we came back 3-4 whatever weeks later at V4, V5 corn, and we put on the remainder, right? And so did we have enough leaching events that moved some of that nitrogen down, possibly out of reach of that corn crop? And so that's why we see the negative effect there, because the zero rate and the check are very similar in both of those years. So it's something that we're still trying to explore, and I think this shows that maybe we do need a little bit more research to kind of dig in and try to figure out what's really going on there, what type of benefits that we can get. So again, I don't think there's evidence that would say that we need to change our total nitrogen program. Obviously, where we had rye cover crop versus no rye cover crop, and we had the 150 pounds, no yield difference, right? So changing the total nitrogen program, I don't think we need to worry about. What we need to kind of look at and examine a little bit more closely is, what benefits can we get from a starter nitrogen, and where maybe is the sweet spot with that, to make sure that we're getting the benefit out of it, and we don't see, like we found in our study, we don't find that negative trend, even though there was no statistical differences there. And then I really do think that strip tillage is a viable option. I'm sure you've heard Allison Robertson talk about the socially distanced rice studies that she's had. And I think that's partly why I say that I think strip tillage is a viable option, because when we get in there, we're putting that corn row right between the rye, so we're not getting the competition effects from the rye. We don't have the disease pathogens right there in that row zone. And so I think there can be some benefits with strip tillage. And I think it is a very viable option as we think about this cereal rye ahead of a corn crop. So I pulled this slide from another slide deck, and kind of thinking about making no-tillage work, as we get into cover crops, because I think that's probably a little bit better than trying to do some tillage following that cereal rye. And so I say, okay, so how do we make no-till and cover crops work? From a planter perspective, it really comes back to some of the very same things that we talk about year in and year out, regardless of what your cropping system is. So you want to make sure that if you're using row cleaners or if you're using a fluted coulter, make sure they're working properly. So we don't want those row cleaners to be doing tillage, right? We want them to engage the residue and not the soil. We want to look at making sure we have adequate down pressure, because that's really what's going to get us that seed placement depth. And then the other part of it is making sure that we get that seed furrow closed behind the planter. So really what happens, and why I'm emphasizing this, for cereal rye ahead of corn, is because we're working in a completely different environment, having that cover crop out there. So we need to get off the tractor a little bit more frequently, make sure that planter is functioning the way we need it to be working, because we can go to and make sure all the other management's right, but if we didn't get the planting operation done correctly, all that other work was for naught. And so making sure we pay attention to some of those differences that we're going to have to be changing, adjusting as we go is going to help get us a little bit better success there. Okay, so I'm going to move into, I'll say move away from kind of the starter and move into something more intermediate to complex. Just to show real briefly here some additional work that we're getting into. So this is a trial with interseeding cover crops that we just started last summer, so in 2020. We have 3 research locations up by Sutherland at Castana and then down by Atlantic at the research farm. And then we had 6 on-farm demonstration locations that were kind of scattered across that western Iowa area. We had 4 cover crops, so annual ryegrass, cereal ryegrass, cowpeas, and red clover. And in 2019, we had kind of played around with a number of different species to see what would maybe establish, what would get going, in the climate that we're dealing with. And those showed a little bit of promise for us, and so that's why we selected those. When I show you the data for the on-farm demonstrations, we did use a mix. And so the mix that we had was cereal rye, cowpeas, red clover, and radishes. And I'll show you that mix when we get to that. And then we had 2 different we had 2 different seeding times. We were seeding into V5 corn and we were seeding into V8 corn. And so just to give you a little insights into what we were looking at there and where we're going, this is the interseeder that we used, thanks to basically to the research farms and a number of different people involved there. And then we had some funding to actually do the plot work from the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. So this is the interseeder that we had, where we had 2 rows that were being seeded between the 30-inch corn rows. And so we were using the duo seed units there. So just to show you kind of what this looks like, this is down at images from Southwest Iowa by the Atlantic, that farm there. So this was June 30th was when the pictures were taken. It was June 8th was when the cover crops were interseeded into that V5 corn. And so you can see the annual rye, cereal rye, and cowpeas. You can visually see that we do have growth there, right? And we're not even a month later. You have to look really closely on the red clover, but there's a couple feet where there is some red clover that has 2 little cotyledons on it, a little stretch of row there. But you really have to look close to be able to see the red clover there. Okay, now switching gears, now we're July 1 for a June 9th planted cover crop into V5 corn up at Sutherland, up at that farm. And here, again, you can very easily see the annual rye, the cereal rye, and the cowpeas, right? You can very clearly see those rows, that growth. You can maybe very faintly see the red clover. Again, we really just, at this time frame, we really just have the cotyledons out there. So I only show you kind of basically a month after that planting, or just short of a month after the seedings on those. As we went back to these every month and we documented what was growing and what wasn't growing and what things look like, one of the things that we noticed was it didn't take very long for that red clover basically to die off. The annual rye started to die off as well pretty quickly. In the July pictures, you could tell they were stressed quite a bit. Not a surprise considering how dry things got across western Iowa last summer, right? So we got into very dry conditions. The cereal rye and the cowpeas, they did hold on up through essentially through crop maturity, but they were so weak that after we harvested, there was so much corn biomass on them. When we went back to collect biomass after harvest, we did not have any cowpea or cereal rye that we could harvest the biomass from. So we don't have good estimates of how much biomass there was from 2020 at that corn maturity stage or time frame. So we're going to change up our sampling protocol and see if we can get a little bit better idea of that next year. We did get corn yields from these plots, and I'm just showing the Atlantic and the Sutherland ones right now. So when we look at, is there differences between the species and the no-rye plots? Essentially, the no-rye plot, by the way, is that black bar that goes across the figure. And so really what we see is that at Atlantic, there's no difference between the no-rye and any of the species. Now, for some reason, even though we didn't have a lot of biomass, there was an advantage, I guess, to not having that cover crop from a corn yield perspective there. So you do see a little bit of a yield drag that's occurred from having those species interseeded. On the right-hand side, you can see the difference between the V5 versus V8. Again, at Atlantic, there's no differences there compared to the no-rye check. We do see, again, that there is a yield drag associated with that interseeding, right, compared to the no-rye check. So there is a little bit of risk to this. There's some things that we still need to learn with it as we move forward. So this is the 5 of the on-farm trial locations that all use that mix with the cereal rye, red clover, radish, and cowpeas. I don't show the 6th on-farm location because it just had annual rye, and I was trying to keep things consistent here for you for this presentation. But when we look at these 5 locations here, one of the things that we see and we can pull out pretty quickly is that it's at Sioux County, Pottawatomie County, and at Lyon County, no yield differences between the no rye and where we had the mix, the no cover crop and where we had the mix. But at Monona County and at Adair County, the no cover crop did yield more than the cover crop mixture that we had. And again, I'm probably going to attribute this a little bit to Monona County. Adair County was that area that we did have more severe drought compared to where we were at with Sioux and Lyon County. Although that doesn't necessarily explain Pottawatomie County, because Pottawatomie and Monona are really close there. So, but we think that the risk here is largely, or at least what we've seen in 2020, that risk is largely in how much rainfall do we have and how much competition is there going to be for soil moisture and water for adequate corn growth and development and yield potential. So kind of summarizing the interseeding, I'm still out there saying, yeah, this may work. We know that there's some people that are doing it with great success, but I think, it's one of these things that is higher risk. Let's be cautious with it. When I look at data, not only here from my trial, but looking at some data from Minnesota, Wisconsin, they've shown that, we can have a yield penalty, especially if we get seeding into something that's earlier than a V5 corn stage. And so really what we got there is essentially before V5, that canopy is open a little bit more so that cover crop is able to establish a little bit better. The yield penalty falls off once we get beyond V5 corn, even out to V8 corn. We don't notice it nearly as much in the research data that we have available. Cereal rye and cowpeas, based on what I did in 2020 and some of the other stuff we did from a pilot project in 2019, cereal rye and cowpeas really did establish quite a bit better for us. They held on longer, definitely in 2020, but they just didn't survive into the fall. And so this whole idea of interseeding cover crops in a corn grain system is going to be very challenging. We'll have to start looking at can we move into possibly a forage situation where we aren't quite as concerned about corn yield, which opens up the ability to using different hybrids, using different seeding rates, potentially playing around with our maturities and our corn planting dates, right? So there may be a little bit more potential when we move into more of a forage system to get some benefits that way. We might be able to have less focus on the actual corn grain yield. Regardless of whether it's interseeding or not, we know that cover crops have a huge learning curve. And so I just wanted to point out some resources that we have available, especially for beginners, are what these are for, where we have going into corn or going into soybeans, some recipes developed in conjunction or coordination with the Midwest Cover Crops Council. And then we also have the Whole Farm Conservation Best Practices Manual, which was developed through the Iowa Learning Farms with a number of different partners there. That has how to, things to consider for not only cover crops, but diverse rotations and no-tillage and strip-tillage adoption. So a couple of resources there to help shorten that learning curve a little bit. And then, I just want to reiterate and restate the thanks to the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. They funded the 3 research trials that I mentioned here. My research lab group with Fernando, Tyler, Valeria, and then our undergrads the last several years. And then I've been working jointly with Allison Robertson on a couple of these trials. And so her research team has really been instrumental as well. So with that, I think we have some time for some questions.